pretty much every top repo you can find, karpathy skills, and you have Anthropic's own posted skills. It seems to be a very hot topic. And the question is, are skills good, or are skills the new snake oil? So in this video, I want to take a look at a few skill repos. I want to read through these skills line for line and go in with a pretty objective mindset of, hey, would this be actually valuable for the LM, or are people just selling us handwritten essays, falsely claiming to be an improvement? Before we dive in, I think it's good for us to get kind of a baseline idea of skills. And so if you're not familiar with skills, it is an MD file, such as this one, which is fed into your agent. So this is Matt Pocock's Ask Matt skill. And so when you're targeting this skill, the LM is going to literally call the skill every single time, right? You can kind of view it as just a standard prompt that you sent at the beginning of your prompt window. There's this article here from UC Irvine that discusses skills.md. It's titled From Anatomy to Smells, an Empirical Study of Skill.md in Agent Skills. It's a relatively new article in July of this year. And they're really harping on this term skill smell. And to me, is going to be what we're investigating, seeing if we can uncover any of that in the skills that we're about to introduce. And so as we discussed, the skills file really provides it a prompt that gets repeated on each request, allowing you to effectively fine-tune the way it does things. Now, there are some absolute nuances to that, and which is why we're investigating this. It goes on to mention that, the way you write these skills can have an impact on their effectiveness. Every line that you're adding to the skill MD has a chance of negatively impacting the output. And there are different types of skills. For instance, Ask Matt would be kind of I imagine this skill is not meant to be used for active development. It's more of a router of for skills. But let's see if we can find one that's more intended to be used during development. So this might be diagnosing bugs, right? So this skill here even describes it. It's a diagnosis loop for hard bugs and performance regression. And so you /debug this or whatever, and it'll execute this skill. And so I don't want to read through this yet because I want us to get a good understanding of the pitfalls of skills before we actually go in and read. So this paper talks about how to identify skill smell. This is what we're primarily going to start with. And so the part that interests us the most here is going to be in the methodology. And so they describe how skill smell falls into two categories, and that is statically detectable smells. And so an oversized skill would fall under this realm. They call it specifically here 5,000 words. And so that would be considered a smell just based off the sheer size. And then the second category is semantically detectable, which requires a bit more of contextual reasoning. They don't go into full depth of how they measure this, but they do call out that the semantically detectable is just based on the context of the file. And so what I assume they're doing, based on the way they describe here, is looking for contradictions, anti-patterns, right? Things that would be deemed as bad engineering behavior, I imagine would also fall under that. PromptDebt, which is a comprehensive study of technical debt across LLM projects. It really just describes kind of the hierarchy of impactful factors when it comes to technical debt with LLM. And the main area that we want to focus on here is on the developer, right? Because some technical debt is introduced by the model provider, but in the case of instructions and skill.md, these are very much on the developer itself and can introduce a lot of technical debt there. And here we can see a table that goes into the percentage of impact for technical debt. And so at the very top here, we have PromptDebt, which really is part of skill and instruction file. Effectively, this could be bundled into this high count here. And it cites PromptDebt as being PromptDebt here. And here it talks about optimizing prompt design. And so their data set revealed that LLM developers often struggle to craft prompts that achieve desired outcome following a correct format and managing the prompt length, which can directly influence the LLM's performance for a given task. Right? This is primarily the concern we're going to have here with these skills.md. Are they shooting us in the foot when it comes to performance and the overall end result? And there's also the factor of cost, right? Are these skills increasing our costs? Are they making it more expensive to run our tasks? And later in the paper, it discusses instruction blocks. In particular here, unclear suboptimal instructions coupled with overly long prompt instructions can severely impact the effectiveness of LLM responses by leading to misinterpretation or incomplete task execution. And so with that in mind, I think skill smells that we're looking for: length, contradictions. And so this is pretty much, kind of what we gathered from the papers we just read. But I really think there's another one here that I haven't seen talked about. And so I'm going to add this as my own skill smell. And I'm going to coin this one human fluff. And what I mean by this First of all, LLMs are not human. Yes, they're trained on our text, but there's certain text and descriptions that it is never going to understand at the level that a human does. There's certain keywords that it knows in this model, right? Frameworks, API, use effect, use state, right? So on and so forth. These are the things it knows well. Yes, it can take something that it's not familiar with and translate it to this, right? If you were to say something like send a request for the name, you don't necessarily have to specify specifically that you're calling an API. It'll pick up on that. But it does have to do some kind of translation from a human language into something that would actually be relevant given the context, right? And so when I say human fluff, I'm really saying words that just add confusion to the end to end. And so this is something that I'm going to look out for, and I think will be a big part here, increasing our technical debt just because we're treating it like it's a human being. And so let's get into this. Here we're going to start with Karpathy's skills. Now, from my understanding, this is not his repo. Somebody just made this repo based on his kind of philosophies with agents. It even says here in the About section, a single CloudMD file to improve upon cloud code behavior derived from Karpathy's observations. So this is not from Karpathy himself, but it's based on observations of LLM coding pitfalls. And these are very popular repos, right? 195,000 stars, freaking millions of forks. A lot of these, authors, they like to make sure their Twitter's at the top. And so we'll go to the SKILL.md. So this has the skills itself. And so right off the bat, right, 2.3 kilobyte skill smell was defined as a file exceeding 5,000 words. And so if we treat 5,000 tokens as the guiding star here, here's an image, by the way, that can kind of give you an idea of what we're looking at. So 5,000 tokens, that's about an essay's worth, a little bit over an essay's worth. And so ideally, when we're looking at these, we kind of want to evaluate how much before or after is that. And so we're going to get a token analyzer. There's this tokenizer here from OpenAI. We're going to use this. Okay, and so this one falls at about 522. And so in terms of length, this is a good length. I think we can give this a check mark in terms of its ability to have a length. And so just so we can keep track of this, right, let's do Karpathy skill smell. And so I think we can give the length a check mark. And so let's read this line by line, and I encourage you to think about this as we go through, right? We've already verified that the length is good, but let's think about contradictions. Let's think about human fluff. Are we saying things that may not translate well to a trained database on code? And so it starts off, behavioral guidelines to reduce common LLM coding mistakes. Merge with project-specific instructions as needed. Trade-off. These guideline bias toward caution over speed. For trivial tasks, use judgment. And so right off the bat, I think this part probably wouldn't be a good idea to include. Part of why I say that is I would kind of deem this to be human fluff, right? Behavioral guidelines to reduce common LLM coding mistakes. This is putting a lot of weight on the LLM. And I think when we're going through this, you can just ask yourself as a human being, do you understand what this means right away? I would say this is very broad and not clear. And so I'm just envisioning this, right? We need to realize these LLMs, they operate best with clear instruction. And this is not clear at all. So I would instantly lose some points there, but let's continue. If it were me personally, I think I would just omit this section. All right, number 1, think before coding. Before implementing, state your assumptions explicitly. If uncertain, ask. If multiple interpretations exist, present them. Don't pick silently. If a simpler approach exists, say so. Push back when warranted. If something is unclear, stop, ask. So when I'm reading this, I'm immediately assuming LLM is just going to ask a shit ton of questions, right? How is it going to be able to determine certainty here, right? State your assumptions explicitly, and if you're uncertain, ask. If it's uncertain, I don't think it would even execute on the operation to begin with. And so when it reads this, I have a feeling it's just going to constantly assume it's uncertain. And we've also said ask twice. And so this, to me, is just going to have the LLM asking pretty much everything at every step without any rhyme or reason. And so the LLM is really just going to look at this, and then the rest is just who cares. These are all do not care. Just fluff to the LLM, whatever, who cares. This is what matters. We're just going to ask them about this every time. And we can also see, really, there's some inconsistency here, right? Because we're telling the LLM, hey, think before you code, which is really a careful approach. Then we're later down the line, goal-driven execution, which is really a goal-driven. And really, these two can't coexist well because you're saying we're going based off of exit criteria. And so this is our guiding star. But then earlier you just got done saying that our guiding star was asking the user. And so you can absolutely envision a case where it's just picking, hey, do I just listen to this step here or do I go to this one? Another concern I have, which I would kind of consider human fluff, is the idea of simplicity first. This adds a little bit of concern on maintainability. I can envision a lot of cases where, depending on the model you're using, this may take it to mean, hey, we don't need to worry about maintainability here. Right? We can stuff all this into one file and care little about the readability just because we want simple. And even outside of this, like I would consider this human fluff, but then we go deeper and we see terminology like this. Touch only what you must. Clean up your own mess. What does this mean? This is what I mean by human fluff. Like when we tell a human being about mess, it's usually pretty obvious what we're talking about. But how is an LLM going to be able to determine what mess looks like? Right? You're running the risk of the LLM interpreting mess as something that's actually intended for maintainability. And also you're kind of assuming that the LLM is making a mess to begin with, right? I would assume this wouldn't be the case. And just taking a step back here, I have concerns about this really just slowing us down. Right, I encourage you to try this skill, but what you're gonna find is that it asks for every fucking thing. This portion here makes the biggest impact. And it makes me wonder, like, what's the point in the LLM? Like, I get it. There are points to this, and I get what it's trying to do, right? It wants you to feel more connected to the code base. And so for karpathy skills, I would give this a 6 out of 10. I feel as though it's using a little bit of it's using too much human fluff. I really think having it ask questions is going to result in really ruining the development experience and adding no real value. I think I saw some contradictions in there. 6 out of 10 seems like a fair score. So the next set of skills we're going to look at are the Matt Pocock skills. His are very famous on the internet. In fact, I think his entire business model now is selling people on skills. I don't know if he sells the skills or if he just sells his courses still, but definitely this is like 99% of what he talks about. And before we get into that, there's this article here from Alan Chan. Something I really, really want to read before we get to it, because to me it's a common occurrence, is this illusion of control. You know, at the end of the day, an LLM undeterministic, right? There are certain things you can do to make it as close to as possible as deterministic, but at the end of the day, it's still undeterministic, right? We know that for a fact. And so a common trend that I see, and I think hopefully you'll see as well when we observe the the Pocock skills, it has a tendency to feel as though it's gaining some control. Pocock's repo, he even calls it out skills for real engineers. Use it for real engineering, not vibe coding, right? He sells you on this idea that you have more control by utilizing his skills. And I really just wanted to read this before we dive in, because I think it's important to call out. And so he says, let me show you a real example. Below is a simplified version of an actual production agent prompt I encountered, reduced from 200 lines to highlight the core pattern. And you can see there's this, absolute slop fest of instruction files here. And he goes into how he identifies kind of this concept of skill slop. So he calls out an anti-pattern of a brittle prompt, right? Treating a prompt as a stable contract when minor wording changes silently break behavior. This is a huge part of why skills are risky, right? It's this assumption that it's a contract that the LLM is just going to abide by at all stops. Unfortunate is even the model you use, right? You could send the same skills.md to a different model and it's going to behave entirely different. And he goes on to say, right, the prompt appears to work and it might work a good bit, but you're not going to notice when it tits up and it's actually negatively impacting your end result. And with it being, a very non-deterministic thing, you will not find this out right away. And so this is the anti-pattern that I really wanted to call out, was this probabilistic rule engine. And I think we may see this with Matt Pocock skills. I will say our newer models are a lot better at listening to skills and instructions. But at the end of the day, when shit hits the fan and you have a lot going on, the agent isn't going to be able to do this at a high rate. All right, so we'll go into his engineering skills, right? Skills for real engineers, as he calls them. And so we'll go into the implement skill, because I think this will be the most interesting. And so this is, I'm assuming, the skill that is for implementing the code. Okay, so this appears to be a router to a... Jesus, man. So we've got like these freaking complex architectures for fucking skills at this point. So it says implement a piece of work based on a spec or a set of tickets. Use /TDD where possible. Not sure what this is referring to. Okay, TDD. Oh, test-driven development, of course. Okay, so this is the one we're going to focus on. Looking at the size of it, it looks pretty good. Let's do a test here. So it is a bit larger than the karpathy skills, but it is still quite small. And so we'll read through it. So description, test-driven development, used when the user wants to build features or fix bugs, test first, mentions red-green refactor, or wants integration test. Go. TDD is the red to green loop. This skill is a reference that makes that loop produce tests worth keeping, what a good test is, where tests go, the anti-patterns, and the rules of the loop. Every section applies on every cycle. Consult them before and during the loop, not after. Okay, so my first question is what is a good test? I'm assuming, yep, okay, so he instantly goes into that right after. When exploring the code base, read context.md, so test names and interface vocabulary, match the project's domain language, and respect ADRs in the area you're touching. My only complaint here is that description kind of already covers this. Right, I think LLMs are well aware of what test-driven development is. I feel like you could go straight into what a good test is, but maybe there's something I'm missing on that nuance. It goes on to say tests verify behavior through public interfaces, not implementation details. Code can change entirely, tests shouldn't. A good test reads like a specification. User can check out with valid cart, tells you exactly what capability exists, and survives refactors because it doesn't care about the internal structure. And then it's pointing to some more MD files for guidelines. And so while this skill here is a pretty good size, I imagine it's going to add up a lot as we go down into these skills, right? Test MD. This is another, 77 line. Is this referencing anything else? Okay. And then mocking MD. So assuming it reads all three of these, you're looking at about 5 or 6 kilobytes, maybe even a little bit more, that are sent each time. But let's go ahead and try out the tokenizer. So this will be for the main skill. It's so weird that we're having to go through nested skills, but okay, 1,000. Okay, so we're looking at about 1522 each time. Okay, so size-wise, it's not too bad. You're definitely under a penny in terms of each time it costs you to send this. Again, I feel like LMs really already understand. It really feels like we're doing some unnecessary lecturing here. Right, an LM already knows what test-driven development. This part here, when exploring the code base, read context.md if it exists. This could be okay, right? Because if we're working with an LM that's not naturally going to this is valid, but I would say this part here and this part here is literally just code smell at that point. And kind of, what we discussed earlier about this illusion of control. I think we really want to believe that we can control the LLM in this way, right? Every section applies to every cycle, consult them before and during. Reality is, yeah, this might work on occasion, but the LLM is not going to listen to you at every step of the way, right? This is just not going to happen. LM will sometimes listen to this. Now, that's not to say it's useless. Like I said, I think the LM will listen to this on occasion. It definitely steers, but if you really think throwing this into your project is going to result in a clear contract that is never violated, you're smoking a pipe, right? Although we talked about how the skill kind of gets fed into every prompt, it's not getting fed in during each step, right? So if you send your prompts, like let's say these are all of your prompts, although it's true that it's going to slot in the skill in between each of these, or we can view this dash line as the skill. It's going to send that in each prompt, but you have to realize that this is going to execute a lot of subtasks, right? If we look at prompt 1, there's a lot of tasks that are being executed after this prompt that it may or may not actually be sending that skill into. And so it's possible you run into a case where, hey, yeah, it listened to your skill for this subtask and it output some, thing about the cycle, and it listened to the cycle thing. But all these other ones, it's just going to disregard it, and you're not going to even have control over that. That's out of your control. You can put as much fancy words as you want into a skill file, but it's not going to guarantee that. And so I won't go into test.md, right? If we read through every one of his skills, we'd be here all day. He's got a lot of these, but I kind of just want to keep going through this one. So he goes on to discuss seams, where tests go. A seam is the public boundary you test at, the interface where you observe behavior without reaching inside. Test lives at seams, never against internal. So it feels like we're just repeating ourselves a bit here. And again, kind of part of the complaint that I had with the karpathy skill of shooting ourselves in the foot. It really feels like we're doing that here. Like, I get it. Everyone wants to feel like they have control over their development progress. It's nice to feel like we have control, but at the end of the day, what is the benefit to an LLM? It's speed. Right? We would not be using these LLMs today if we couldn't get quicker output. And the reality is you're not going to read through all this damn code anyway. I envision 99% of the users of this skill, they're just chalking it in their code base and then going back to autopilot. Somebody actually had this mindset of, I want full control over my development process. I want to feel like, I'm there every step of the way. I really don't think they would be using a skill like this. And if we're going to rate pocock skills, say he also gets a pass on the length. I think there's definitely a good amount of length, especially when you're adding in nested skills like this. I know he's treating these as separate files, but literally the LM's just going to take these each time anyway, which I get it at this point. This is like a object level programming, so it's trying to keep it clean and separated. I get that. So I wouldn't fault it there. Contradictions, I actually think his contradiction level is pretty low. At least from this one that I'm reading here, I don't see anything that stands out to me as being a contradiction. And so he does have that advantage. Human fluff is definitely here. I would say there's a lot of tutorial speak in this. Right, I really don't think we need to describe what test-driven development is to the LM. I think we're repeating it here. I think when we say things like this, it adds no value to the LM whatsoever. right? The skills are the reference that makes the loop produce tests worth keeping. Like, what does any of this stuff matter to the LLM, right? This is assuming that the LLM is a human being and that we can communicate to it like a tutorial. And so I would say human fluff is definitely there. Overall, from my read, I would say his skills are better than the Karpathy skill, an 8 out of 10. And so if you asked me, right, which skill would I use? I think there's one worth mentioning, which is no skill at all, right? Here's the thing about no skill at all. It passes on all these metrics. Now, I know that's being egregious, but I do want to point out that the LLM comes packaged a certain way, right? You have to realize every model that you get, it's trained on data and it's designed a certain way. And every skills.md instructions file that you're adding onto it, it's adjusting its behavior, its natural tendencies. And so you are pretty much guaranteed introducing technical debt. It really does not matter what you put in the skills.md. There is some form of technical debt being introduced. Whether that's worth it depends on your use case. But I think Pocock is famous for having a skill called Grill Me. God, it's freaking nested depths of... Okay, it's apparently impossible to find, so I'm not going to spend an hour trying to find it, but he does have certain skills that are fine-tuned for like learning purposes. I think it's okay in certain contexts to introduce this technical debt as long as it's not intended for development. In my opinion, if you're doing anything for development, you should not be using a skill. Really, skills should be viewed as a mistake. If you feel the need to use a skill, that tells me either you're doing something weird that the LLM doesn't know about, or the LLM is weird, which maybe that's fine, and you're okay with that, and you're willing to accept this technical debt that you're introducing. But I still say skills should be treated as a mistake at the end of the day. Right? If I could rename skills, I would just name it duct tape. But unfortunately, that doesn't work as well. Nobody wants to say they're adding duct tape to their LLM. And this is basically what you're doing. Right, you're doctoring your LLM with these new instructions. It's really not going to listen to 100% of the time. But when it does, you're snipping it, right? You're going against its natural tendencies. And this paper here from Amon Mehta, hope I'm pronouncing that okay. Now this kind of discusses the realities of using different LLMs as well, right? Just because that skill works for, say, GPT, does not mean it's going to work for a notice, right? Skill smells, once they're there, they're there. As we've discussed, right, it's going to keep sending that skill. And so every bit of smell that you have here is going to compound and compound and compound. And really, I believe even in a perfect world, it doesn't make sense to use these as true beneficiaries. The amount of control here is very inconsistent. And so what you end up with is the LLM sometimes listening and then sometimes not listening. So you end up with more inconsistency, right? If I tell the LLM, hey, test-driven development, now here's what a good test is, it might listen a couple times, but then the other 10 times it didn't listen. And so now we have an inconsistent code base, right? We have a code base that's listening sometimes to these instructions, but then going off and doing whatever it wants for the other. And so overall, I think skills should be viewed as technical debt. I think there's a place for them. I think there are cases where you might want one, right, for a very specific scenario, or in the case of, Matt Pocock skills for learning purposes. I think when we view them for what they really are, which is just a bunch of human speak that tries to steer the LLM to do something, but in reality, there's no contract here. This is not a contract. It's still probabilistic. I also encourage you to realize a lot of the skill providers I find, they don't really code that much. I'm not going to go into that. Yeah. Anyway, I encourage you to think for yourself on this. I think the narrative that we're seeing going around of skills being this all great thing, and a lot of people are profiting off of it, and it's a dangerous realm to be in. But if we view it as, technical debt, duct tape, I think we'll be in a good spot. Use it only when you need it. Don't use it ideally. Stick to what the LLM knows and is good at, and only use skills.md where you're doing something weird or very context specific.